We're going to reset the stage here, and as we do that, I'm going to give a little introduction to our first panel, which is going to start momentarily, on funding for decarbonization. And just for some context there, 60% of the compliance obligations for Local Law 97 are in the multifamily housing sphere. And it's becoming clearer that 3 distinct challenges exist for that sector. First, no one is consolidating that market to lower costs or economies of scale to negotiate lower pricing for equipment or for installation. Second, no one is providing truly a turnkey solution where you can call just one place, just one phone number, just one website, and energy efficiency and electrification happens with far less hassle. And third, no one is offering easier financing, lower cost financing, with low or no upfront capital. Those are the 3 challenges that we really need to think about. And what if we found a new model that actually solved for those challenges? Well, it would be revolutionary. It would move the market, it would move the needle that where we needed to go for our decarbonization goals, and it would serve as a model for the rest of the nation. So our next panel is going to explore those issues and the concepts. These are just concepts that could offer solutions. Chris Halfnight, who's Urban Green's Senior Director of Research and Policy, is going to research the panel. Moderate the panel. You could research it too if you want. He's going to moderate the panel, but he's going to come up in just a moment. First, I want to introduce James Geppner. He's the Senior Project Manager at NYSERDA, who's going to kick us off with a concept overview. So James, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. That was an excellent introduction. I feel like you just made my job a lot easier. So I'd like to describe briefly a new concept in project delivery. This is a concept we've been investigating for about 2 years now, and I believe it's one that would significantly drive down project costs for building owners as well as significantly drive down complexity. Before I get into the details, I just want to say it is a concept at this stage. It's under exploration, but it's only under exploration. Nothing I say here should be taken as a commitment by NYSERDA to develop this program or launch a program. So let's talk about the status quo for a second. All of you are familiar with it, but I just want to lay out some general background here. Between a project trigger, whether it's recapitalization, acquisition, failure of a mechanical system, and the point at which funds are dispersed, a building owner faces tremendous challenges and headwinds to implement a project. First of all, there's a high degree of complexity, high degree of uncertainty, and things are very expensive. So whatever we do, we need to solve those problems. And anything short of those problems is not really going to be a solution that is going to be right for us. So I know there's going to be some variability in experience of building owners, so some of what I'm going to say is going to be very relevant to multifamily building owners and maybe less relevant to Class A office buildings. So when initiating a project, what occurs? First of all, there's a long period of uncertainty of cost. There's uncertainty of feasibility. There's high costs with no visible pathway for reducing those costs for that building owner. There's a time-consuming process of finding which is the right installer for the system. There's high and significant transaction costs, right? If a project doesn't go through, if it's not implemented, then that cost is borne by the building owner. And there's also inconsistent costs between similar projects. So at the beginning of the timeline, when initiating a project, these are some of the headwinds. And there's also an absence of protections for building owners. So these are things that every time a building owner tries to implement a project, they face. And this obviously impairs the building owner's ability to execute the project. So last point, particularly important, missing is a plan to reduce cost. And the long price discovery period is just another issue because it pushes back that moment when a building owner goes, okay, this is a financial project, we can proceed. Innovation is needed, obviously. So the next part of the timeline, when you start to finance a project, what occurs there? Well, there's a long period of time between that project, when that project is scoped, when you know it's financeable. The underwriting process can add to the upfront capital requirements, say if some value of that upgrade is discounted by the lender, and performance risk is carried by the building owner. That is a big issue. So, and then of course, in other cases, as you know, some buildings face issues with creditworthiness. Some can't obtain capital mid-recap cycle. So these are all the contexts in which building owners try to pursue projects. And furthermore, lenders might not have, some do, some don't, the in-house technical expertise necessary to make that financing period short. So in short, these mechanisms that exist are limited in what they can do. There are good ones, but there are limits to all of them. So, for building owners that have low cash on hand, this can be a problem, as well as for some other building owners. So the concept we've been exploring is one of a turnkey delivery program. So basically, it's an all-in-one delivery program that would include installation of equipment, financing of installation, and would give basically building owners a new way to comply with local performance standards, so Local Law 97. All residential and commercial properties under a building performance standard would be eligible for the program. And the cost would be paid through an assessment on the tax bill. So the equipment installation would have turnkey delivery, pre-qualified installers, strong oversight, uniform pricing sheets, standardized contracts, and some reduced performance risk. That is overall how it occurs. So how would that occur? There are 4 parts to the concept. So having an entity, which is currently doesn't exist in the marketplace, that sits between building owners and the providers that they hire. That entity having, basically all-in-one solutions available for the building owners, available to the eligible buildings, I should say, again, the buildings that are under a building performance standard. The municipality taking care of collections of the fees that are amortized over the period of the useful life of the equipment, and a revolving fund at the state level that would then fund that turnkey delivery company and make these solutions available. So making sure I don't forget anything here. Yes. So in the design of the concept, we were focused primarily on 2 parties. Basically, how can this work for a municipality, and how can this work for a building owner? What will significantly reduce complexity, drive down costs? Overall, this mechanism is not something new. We know the concepts that have been floating around for quite some time now. Pool risk, have standardized contracts, transfer some of the risk away from the building owners. These ideas that have all been floating out, so how do we actually combine them under the roof of a single concept? So for building owners, what I see is this occurring. So reduced complexity, a single point of contact, no financing process, simplified contracting, only qualified solutions are on offer, and no or a lower upfront capital requirement. For reduced costs, how does that occur? Well, bulk procurement contracts, lower transaction costs. And the transaction cost thing is really important because actually transaction costs contribute tremendously to the overall project costs. Low cost capital, and again, uniform pricing sheets. And reduce uncertainty, faster pricing discovery, no waiting to find out if a project is financeable, no transaction risk, and strong oversight of the entity doing project delivery, and independent verification that the measure was actually installed correctly. So that is what I see as being the rewards to the building owner. But there are also rewards on the other side. But before I get into those, just a few words about the building owner protections. So strong oversight of the companies, transparency of costs, independent verification, consistent pricing, eligible measures determined by NYSERDA, and transfer some of the performance risk. So those are sort of some of the key animating ideas driving this concept. So for providers, costs come down when it works for both sides of the table, both sides of the transaction. So long-term contracts to give providers some visibility. That's really a key thing. The lack of predictability of this industry really drives up costs, prevents from hiring decisions, investments in software, in equipment, increased project volume. So there's a sharp increase in the projects due to reduction in the financing constraints, and reduced customer acquisition costs, which really drives costs. So all these things, I think, would give providers an ability to reduce their cost structure, be profitable, and deliver a good service. This mechanism that I'm describing also differs from a lot that's in terms of just purely financing that exists in the market today. Turnkey delivery is not, there's no comparative financial mechanism. Lower upfront capital requirements, no lender consent required, lower cost of capital, and applicable to the entire residential market. So those are just a few things that would differentiate this from other products in the market. So just the last word, the status quo is incredibly complex. And that timeline from that trigger to the disbursement of funds for the building owner is really just fraught. So this concept just tries to improve that process, actually put something forward that can simplify it and improve all the major dimensions of the building owner's experience. And currently, they're really, or at least I haven't seen, a plan to substantially drive down project costs. We think this concept would be one that would do it. And with that, Chris?
Is this on? There we go. Fantastic. Thank you so much, James, for that very helpful sketch. Please, I'll welcome you to the panel here. Also ask all of our panelists for this session to please come up onto the stage. Hello, everybody. My name is Chris Halfnight. I'm Senior Director of Research and Policy here at Urban Green Council. I am delighted to be here with all of you, and also delighted to be digging into this comprehensive, innovative retrofit delivery idea with our panelists today. Those of you who are standing in the back, there are seats still. There's some up at the front here to my right at the front, so please feel free to come on in and sit down. And I will take a seat myself and introduce our panelists. Welcome, everybody. We have a wonderful panel here for you today to help us unpack this idea, to look at it from some different perspectives and different expertise. To my left, we have Marc Zuluaga, who is the co-founder of Cadence OneFive and their data-backed, comprehensive software platform to streamline building upgrades and retrofits. Marc was the CEO of Stephen Winter Associates before his time at Cadence, and he was a practitioner there for 20 years as well. Welcome, Marc. To Marc's left, we have Joe Chavez, who is the Deputy Director of Buildings at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Joe leads the city's efforts to decarbonize the building sector, and of course, in that role, he is at the very heart of the city's implementation of Local Law 97. And to Joe's left, we have Susan Leeds. Welcome, Susan. Susan is a leading light in green finance. She is an energy finance consultant at Garrison Associates. Many of you know her as the founder and for a long time the CEO of NYSERDA, the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, which is New York City's green bank. And you met James already, so welcome, everybody. Susan, my first question is for you. You've been part of a large team with wide-ranging expertise, legal, financial, technical, and otherwise, helping NYSERDA to develop this concept over a couple of years. How would you characterize the value proposition in this approach, and how does it stack up against other ideas for support and financing for retrofits in the market?
Thanks, Chris. This is working? Okay, everyone can hear me, great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm so excited about this concept, and it was great to hear, James, your excellent summary of it. And I'll answer your question by saying, well, I think, first of all, you explained the value proposition fairly well, but I'll put my own spin on it. So this new program delivers Local Law 97 compliant building retrofits in a turnkey, outsourced manner. In other words, the building owner does not have to directly scope the project, bid it out, engage contractors, and manage project completion, and then separately go to the lending markets to obtain financing. Rather, the program combines project design, development, installation, and financing in one comprehensive solution. It would be available to any and all buildings that are subject to Local Law 97. And the program design explicitly seeks to drive down the cost of compliance through aggregation and economies of scale, as James was explaining, while also providing a straightforward and affordable means for buildings to pay for the improvements through a tax assessment that can be amortized for up to a 30-year period, and that takes advantage of low municipal borrowing costs. So that's my summary of the value proposition. And let's just talk for a moment then about the competing approaches and alternatives. Well, yes, there are multiple financing options, fortunately, for retrofits available today. Loans through banks, CDFIs, credit unions, and specialty green lenders like NYSEG. Green mortgages, we have CPACE, and we have some other kind of more off-the-run solutions like energy service agreements. So there's some great options out there for financing projects today. However, I would say that I haven't seen a comprehensive approach quite like this new program that combines project implementation and financing in one solution, and that makes it available through a public-private partnership structure to all types of privately owned buildings subject to Local Law 97, including smaller buildings, residential buildings, and buildings across the credit spectrum. So in this respect, I think that the concept is new and different and additive to what's available on the market today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Susan. I just want to remind the audience that we'll be taking audience questions after a few more moderator questions through Slido. So you can go to slido.com and enter code UGC, and that'll give you the option to input questions and also upvote questions. And I'll be looking on my iPad here for questions that are getting a lot of upvotes. Joe, turning to you. We are, of course, now in the midst of the very first compliance submissions for Local Law 97. I think that's a milestone that we can celebrate. There's been a long road to get here. We also, of course, have significant work to do to get to 2030 when far more buildings will be facing the need to decarbonize. How are you seeing the needs in the market to scale Local Law 97 retrofits over the next 5 to 10 years with 2030 and beyond in mind? And where do you think this approach might meet some of those needs?
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Urban Green, for hosting this conversation. I think it's an important one that we need to be having. And thanks, NYU, for hosting us. I think we're at an inflection point with energy efficiency and decarbonization, and I think Local Law 97 is driving that at this point. I think the past 10 to 15 years have been primarily focused on energy efficiency and looking at maybe individual measures in a building where we can save energy and save money. And a lot of the changes have been driven by a return on investment in that energy savings. And I think where things are changing is that decarbonization is focused on a reduction in carbon, not necessarily a reduction in energy, which is valued through electricity rates or energy rates, utility rates. And what Local Law 97 is doing is placing a value on carbon for the first time in New York City in the form of penalties if buildings are over their limits. And so that's causing the whole industry to reevaluate projects and how we, are undertaking these projects, how we're funding them with incentives, how we're financing these projects. And I think, as Susan was saying, there are a lot of tools already in the market for funding and financing these types of projects. But where these projects differ from energy efficiency, which I think we're probably all familiar with, upgrading lights to LEDs, installing better temperature controls in buildings, and making sure they are insulated and weatherized. All of those projects have a return on investment and are relatively low cost. if we look at decarbonizing a building or electrifying a building, we're looking at base building systems. We're looking at a boiler and an entire heating or cooling distribution system. We're looking at building envelopes and shells. And to retrofit those items is costly, right? And I think what we see with incentives is that they are not covering enough of a portion of those costs to make those projects pencil out. We are, some of the financing tools, especially traditional financing tools, are looking at these projects and, they are too costly. They are not financeable. And so I think like that is a challenge that we're currently facing when we look at buildings that are attempting to undertake these larger projects, is like some of them, I'm not going to say all of them, some of them this does work and it is penciling out, but for others, there are real barriers. And I don't think we yet have the tools in the market to deal with this. And I think the one that is being proposed is a good opportunity worth exploring.
Fantastic, thanks, Joe. Marc, turning to you and the multifamily sector, which is your area of expertise. The multifamily sector is the majority of the local law 97 market, both by building count and by building area. It's also arguably the sector facing the most challenging transition, partly because of a heavy reliance on fossil fuels for heating and hot water. What opportunities are you seeing with this conceptual approach, with this model for the multifamily sector, and maybe specifically the smaller multifamily buildings, the middle-income co-ops, others that have been at times vocal about the uncertainties and the potential challenges in their path through local law 97?
Thanks, Chris. So I cheated on this one, and I pinged Kelly Dowdery at First Service Residential. And what I heard from her is the top 3 barriers today for smaller buildings, particularly co-ops, are money, time, and trust. Other than that, we got it covered. So money, basically, obviously financing addresses that. This is expensive work, addresses that directly. But more fundamentally, this is kind of once-in-a-generation infrastructure upgrades that are needed. So the idea of asking the people that happen to live in a particular building today to pay for work that really is 30-year work is just fundamentally unfair, especially when probably half of them won't be there in, say, 15 years. So it's not just financing, but long-term financing, 30 years, like James and Susan were saying, that I think is really ideal here. In terms of the time factor, what Kelly meant by that is just the brain damage the small owner with many other responsibilities, the co-op board member, need to go through to just vet, diligence, and get their head around these ideas. So having a completely outsourced option that takes on the performance risks is obviously getting at that. The performance risk component also addresses the trust part, but more than anything, today in the market, a large owner can mitigate risks in a way that a small, mom and pop shop can't. So if I own 100 buildings, the leverage I have over a contractor that goes into any one of my buildings is fundamentally different than if I'm one of the little guys, right? So what a lot of this is doing is bringing the benefits that a large owner has right now to the little guy, but even greater benefits in terms of cost compression and other opportunities that happen in the market today. I mean, taking a step back from the compliance angle alone, I'm just going to state a fact here. New York City is the greatest city in the country. We know that, right? I would then ask, why do we have the worst HVAC? You can put lipstick on a pig, but straight up steam heat sucks, as evidenced by the EUI of every steam heated building in the city. Our ventilation systems don't suck enough. By the time you get to the bottom floor, there's not enough suction. You hold up a toilet paper and the vent won't cover it. And we have these little accordion flaps next to our window air conditioners. So the idea of this as an opportunity to modernize really infrastructure at the least possible cost and least possible brain damage is an incredible opportunity for us to really take advantage of. With residential buildings specifically, the apartment is the single most repeatable space use type in all of New York City. As Jason Block and my team likes to say, the risk aversion in this industry has resulted in a benefit of everyone built the same building fundamentally over and over and over again for a generation before switching designs. There's a finite number of typologies. So, in principle, it's a highly scalable industry. I've tried to argue in many forums that, in order to get to scale, we need standards, which I think there's some truth to. But what I've learned from Susan, actually, that's even more true than that, is in order to have standards in the first place, we need to have scale. It's not actually a standard until everybody does it. And I'm really excited about this mechanism as being the kind of thing that can pull forward the volume of retrofits that will really drive true standardization in a way that I think will be beneficial to the market as a whole, but particularly beneficial to the multifamily sector that frankly needs the most help.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marc. I want to open up questions to the whole panel, so please, any of you, feel free to jump in on this one. And I see some questions coming in on Slido. That's great. Encourage you again to go on Slido, enter code UGC, enter questions, and upvote questions so I can ask our panelists. So there are a lot of architects, engineers, energy managers, sustainability professionals, and other service providers in the audience today. Implementing retrofits is essentially core to their business model. How should they be thinking about their role in the local Law 97 market and this retrofit delivery concept? You each have a microphone, so please feel free to jump in when you like.
Okay, I'll take a shot at it, but I'll defer to you, Marc, because you're probably the more knowledgeable party on this one. But I mean, I think I expect this program to really increase the pie for many firms that are currently delivering local Law 97 services. More buildings will have a feasible, realistic path to local Law 97 compliance, especially, Joe, as you point out, in 2030. Right, so yes, this program establishes a new role, the aggregator role that James was describing, but that does not supplant the need for the various firms that you just mentioned, Chris, to deliver services to buildings at the building level. So I see it as a fantastic opportunity. And over to you, Marc.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, the idea of a growing pie, something like Local Law 87, our audit law, is by definition a shrinking pie. There's only a certain number of buildings that get assessed every year. The price for those assessments is going down and down and down. So the idea of energy professionals here building out services to be part of more year-over-year construction, I think is pretty exciting. I think the linchpin of that is cost. We've kind of lost our way a little bit as an industry, and anyone who talks to an owner understands the sticker shock here. So I think the one thing we want to share above all about all our case studies and projects is how much did it actually cost, so that we can be laser focused on getting that number down. I think there's no reason as an industry we couldn't come together to figure out how to deliver these upgrades in a typical apartment that really, hugely impact the resident experience in a positive way, enhancing ventilation, that are grid friendly, and that come in, get them under the carbon caps for, say, through 2040, and that come in at a cost of, say, under $30,000 in an apartment. That amortized over 30 years would be the cost of 1 cup of coffee per apartment per day. I don't know about you, but I buy my oat milk latte because I want it, not because I need it, so it has to be a desirable scope. A lot of buildings will be able to afford that. Some won't, and all the incentives should go towards them, in my view. But I think there's a huge opportunity for these kind of service professionals to help transition us from a world of scarcity, which is where we are today, where a handful of projects get built every year at a very high cost, to a world of abundance where tons and tons and tons of projects get done at a much lower cost per project.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marc. So I guess broad brush, what you've heard about here is a public-private partnership with a centralizing role for government, a private sector delivery concept, and long-term low-cost financing repaid via the property tax bill and unlocking sort of public finance rates. There are incredible advantages to each of those aspects. You've heard about some of them. There are also likely some drawbacks to each of those aspects, and I don't want to be too Pollyannish about the potential here. So I'd love to hear from each of you, what are one or maybe two crucial risks, issues, questions you have about that would need to be fully worked through in order to make this vision a reality?
I don't need to jump in here first, but two things stick out to me, which is understanding workforce capacity and making sure the capacity mechanisms are in place. The second is really being very detailed about the cost structure of the entity, that aggregator, making sure that entity is lean and efficient and delivering maximal value, is not just a sclerotic organization that's adding cost to a project. That would defeat the purpose.
Great. Susan, over to you, if you'd like.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, James. So yeah, this is a complicated model with a lot of moving parts. And it's new and it's innovative, and the concept is it's going to be managed by the public sector. And I think therein lies some questions about capacity, some questions about trust, some questions of just really being able to pull this off. And I'm just going to take kind of a broad look at that question and be a little aspirational. Because when I think about it, I think that both New York State and New York City, of course, with crucial roles to play in the design and delivery and administration of this program, have really strong track records of marshaling government resources to protect us from the harms of pollution and climate change. To name just a few examples, New York State, and many of you may not be familiar with this, has a very well-established state revolving fund called the Environmental Facilities Corporation, with a long history of protecting our water supply and doing it through a mechanism very similar to what we are talking about today. A 30-year track record, if I remember correctly, with about $40 billion of municipal bonds raised to implement water purification projects. We have the country's largest green bank. And of course, we have NYSERDA itself, with a long history of successful programs. New York City has established programs to support Local 97, such as the Accelerator, 321 Go, and has seeded and enjoys strong working relationships with quite a wide range of innovative nonprofit organizations that support this sector. I now have the pleasure of working around the country in this area, and our resources here in New York are widely viewed as examples of what a lot of other people in a lot of other places want to do. So how is this addressing the question of the risks that we're talking about? Well, I feel that here at the state and the city, we have experience with almost every approach out there. We have dedicated professionals working in the public sector and adjacent to the public sector. We have deployed significant funding streams over the years, and we have learned from this. So, I mean, I feel that this program puts the knowledge that we have and the experience to work in a new configuration, really seeking to address the challenge, Joe, that you so clearly articulated a few minutes ago with Local 97 and the upcoming compliance in 2030. And I think, yes, there are going to be questions and challenges about capacity and execution, for sure. But can we rise to meet the challenge? You know, I think that we can.
Great, thanks, Susan. Joe, any thoughts?
Sure, and I'm going to keep my city hat firmly on for this from a government perspective. I think as the city, if we are sponsoring something like this, you know, and allowing these loans to be repaid on a tax bill, I think the city is very concerned about our own liability and also the protection of consumers in a model like this. And so I think those would be the areas that we would want to focus on fleshing out and understanding more. You know, how is the city protected in a model like this, but also how are we ensuring that any of the building owners that are partaking in a program like this also have the protections that they need in place, you know, to ensure that you know, the work is successful and we're satisfied with the end result. But I will say, you know, look at CPACE as a model or an example. You know, that CPACE exists in maybe the majority of states across the country now and is an incredible tool that is a partnership between private lenders and the city for financing, you know, what started as energy efficiency work and now has evolved to finance resiliency work in some other states. Hopefully, you know, that bill passes in the state legislature so we can finance resiliency with CPACE as well. But I think CPACE is very different from how this model would work, but I think we can look to that as an example for something that maybe people thought, what, the city's gonna, put this on your tax bill and you're gonna repay your, your energy project over time that way? Like, that sounds crazy. Like, the city would never do something like that. Well, the city is doing that, and a number of cities are. And so I think, we want Local on 97 to succeed. We, believe that there's a better future for New York City with cleaner air, better, more efficient buildings where you don't have to open your windows in the winter just to stay comfortable and listen to those sirens all night long and cats and whatever else is out there. I think we're open. New York City, I believe, also is one of the greatest cities in the world, and that is partly because we are innovative. We are open to new solutions and open to new ways of doing things, and I think this is one of them that I will say again is worth exploring.
Fantastic. Marc, thoughts on risks, considerations, concerns we need to fully address working this out?
Yeah, on the consumer protection front, I think it's, in my experience at least, it's probably impossible for human beings, I don't know about generative AI, but human beings to come up with prescriptively defined program requirements that don't somehow kind of trip us up a little bit in the future, even despite our best intentions. So a question I would ask is, how can the city, in a true public partnership way, set up a framework that allows for multiple of these turnkey aggregators to compete on delivering outcomes that continually, in response to market conditions, drive down costs year over year and drive up customer experience? I think that's the kind of thing that we really haven't had, and I'd be excited to see that sort of framework being thought through.
Excellent. Thank you, Marc. I'm going to wrap up the moderator questions and move to audience questions after one last question for Joe and for James as the representatives of city and state on the panel here. If we were to move forward, how does this happen? What are the key steps, and how long might it take? What's the timeline to make something like this a reality?
So I just want to remind again that this is a concept of a program. There's been no commitment. You recognize that's a theme. So there would be three major tracks to getting off the ground. So once we, if it passes an internal process, then in terms of simply getting a thing launched, we would need about, after it was vetted and if it were approved, it would take about 1.5 years to get it on its feet. But there's also a legislative requirement, so let's just put that as its own timeline. And then third, coordination with the city. So there's sort of three variables in terms of timing to get this going.
Great. Joe, what about from the city's perspective?
Well, I'll also frame this in that we are only exploring this. And from the city's perspective, I mean, I think right now this exists as a concept, right, that could be applied to any municipality, but New York City is not any municipality. And so I think we really need to take a look at how this would work in New York City. 50,000 buildings are covered by Local Law 97, and to start something innovative at that scale would require a tremendous amount of work. And so, I would say, are there ways that we can phase this? Are there ways that we can pilot this? And then, there's so much legal effort that needs to be undertaken from the city standpoint, as I was speaking to earlier, with just liability on the city's end, with, if this kind of central aggregator where building owners are going for the solutions and the financing, kind of for this whole turnkey solution, if that's a city contract, then anyone who's had a city contract may know how complicated that is. So I think that there's a whole procurement aspect to this that we really need to explore. But again, I will say there are models for how things like this have been done in the past through a public and private partnership, and I will reference again CPACE as one of them that we've gone through, and we've done that. And so, I don't want to say from a city's perspective that this is impossible. I think there are ways to get it done, but it will take some dedicated effort to exploring how this would specifically work in the context of not just New York City as a city, but also in partnership with our city government.
Great, thank you both. Did you want to jump in again, James?
I was just going to say there are a number of moving parts.
Yes, so fast and slow at the same time. Lots of momentum, lots of work to do. So let's turn to audience questions. And those of you standing in the back, they'll just point out again, there are chairs, open chairs at the front here. So please feel free to come on down and grab a seat. Our leading question is focusing on tenants. Are there mechanisms in place to prevent local law 97 compliance costs from being unfairly passed on to tenants? And I guess specifically in the context of this concept, this model, and maybe let's expand that a bit to rental buildings and tenants. How do they fit into the picture?
So if a building is regulated affordable housing, there are definitely protections in place that cap the amount landlords can increase rents for major capital improvements. But in market rate buildings, that does not exist. And I think currently owners of market rate multifamily buildings have had to price in improvements into rates, into rising utility costs, into other costs, increasing costs that they are facing. And I think that that is a challenge that we are facing with decarbonizing buildings and electrifying buildings and making these investments, is how do we keep costs down? I think this model poses some opportunities to reduce costs through bulk purchasing of equipment and streamlining the installation process and lowering risk for financing, which would bring the financing costs down. Perhaps maybe there wouldn't even be a financing cost. We would have to see. But so I think this proposes a solution that could resolve a lot of these concerns over cost. And perhaps even in the model, there is ways that, the city can impose some guardrails of if a building owner takes advantage of this type of funding or program, they wouldn't be able to increase rates or up to a certain, we could look at some parameters around that and would certainly do that if this was going to be used in affordable or regulated housing in any way.
Great, thank you, Joe. Anyone want to add anything to that? Or?
I was going to say that, there'd be a collaboration process between NYSERDA and the city to make sure there are lots of protections.
Great. Thank you, James. Our next question is about condos and co-ops. This sector operates very differently from rental multifamily residential. The question is, have you engaged these groups to ensure the program will work for this large group of multifamily residential? And maybe I'll expand that a little bit. We touched on the where it may meet some of the challenges for that sector, but Marc, if you have anything you want to add to that, or if others want to weigh in on engagement and sort of fit with the co-op condo sector.
Sure. Well, I think we really all as a group make decisions socially, right? So it's really important. You talk to a Upper West Side co-op board and they say, well, who else did this project? And you say a building. They said, no, who else in the Upper West Side did the project? And so I think the more that we can sort of bring transparency to the early successes of the market and get these case studies and get people to sort of understand that another building like me, a comp like me, did this, that's going to go a long way to engaging any sector. And within the co-op sector, there's a different set of comps than within rentals or Class A or that sort of thing. So I think that's certainly part of it. But again, building an attempt at an easy button that really outsources a lot of this work from the co-op boards, I think goes hand in hand with that. But we really have to, share the results, and they have to be successful results that people like, so they want to move into buildings that are not broken, and they see that as an option. I think that's going to take some time to get to.
Great, thanks, Marc. Anyone else want to weigh in on that one?
Just quickly to say that, and I think I'm just going to repeat something, James, you've mentioned a few times and others have as well. This program is in the design and development phase now. And I think the good thing about that is that it affords a lot of opportunity to get input from the people who will use it. And that's what we want to do as this work carries forward. We want to directly engage with co-ops and condos and their representatives to understand what kind of experience they need and how we can ensure in the design phase that we're taking those things into consideration.
Great point, Susan. Thank you. Next question is about PACE by comparison. So it's how would this new program have lower transaction costs than PACE? The cost of capital and transaction costs tend to make PACE financing not very attractive. So James, Susan, or anybody else, can you speak to where that lower cost of capital comes from and maybe unpack that a little bit for the audience?
Okay, well, I guess a fundamental point here is that the capital source for the program is primarily municipal bonds. I should point out that it's not exclusively municipal bonds. There is a need for a public sector contribution of equity capital into this program as a concept to seed it and to get it off the ground. But the ongoing source of capital is municipal bonds, and municipal bonds will tend to have lower cost and longer terms relative to other capital sources. But I think that there's more to say about PACE and the comparison with PACE. So first point, PACE can be a great solution for certain buildings. No argument there. But there are limitations that some buildings experience in accessing PACE. And so in some sense, we can think of, this program picks up where PACE leaves off. Like, for example, PACE requires lender consent, and this can be a lengthy process, and there are some cases of lender disapproval rates being a problem. And there's no forcing mechanism for that. The new program, as conceptualized, would not require lender consent. And PACE also doesn't have the element of standing up the comprehensive solution that supports turnkey project delivery. So I just will reiterate, PACE is a great solution. It's available today, and it works for a lot of buildings, but we see this as building on what's available through PACE.
Great, thank you, Susan. Our next question is focused on disadvantaged communities and LMI buildings, and I think it's an opportunity to talk about this issue more broadly in the program. So the question is, these buildings or buildings in those communities can be denied loans due to arrears and poor financials. What flexible financing options can lenders offer when standard criteria aren't met? So maybe could you touch a little bit on this idea of creditworthiness, on circumstances where buildings might be more distressed than others, and how the program might think about that?
Sure. So first, without respect to LMI communities, just for all potential eligible buildings, there would be a formula applied to make sure that the tax burden wasn't undue and challenge the viability of the building, right? So that would be the core protection that would occur. With LMI, there are individual credit checks are necessary with all senior debt products. All senior debt products are looking at debt service coverage ratios, loan to value. This concept would pool all the cumulative debt under a single revolving fund, and the credit structure would have enhancements to it that would basically allow funding to be provided to those projects. So if the project scope did not burden the property unduly, then there would not be a credit check, with the one caveat that any partnering municipality would determine what the eligible buildings were. So if a building was behind in their taxes, the municipality itself might say, okay, this building is not eligible for the program.
Great, thanks, James. I got one more question that might be headed your way. I'm not sure, but focused on insurance issues. So there are of course lots of insurance issues for buildings to navigate. Sorry, it's jumping around here. There it is. Dealing with insurance issues, like making sure the project conforms with buildings' existing coverage, seems to resist a turnkey treatment. Do you have thoughts on this? How the program might approach something like that, and any considerations to date on how insurance at the building level kind of
So it's
interrelates?
Existing property policy.
Yes, I believe so.
I don't know of any issues that would arise from that. Obviously, whatever the coverage areas would be, the benefit to the building would accrue to the risks that now the building faces. So I think it would be a net positive from an insurance point of view. Obviously, that's going to be a project-to-project basis. It should never be a net negative. But yeah, there's probably, I mean, in general, it's hard to drill down in details on any given project on that particular topic.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Let's talk about ESCOs. I had this question when I first encountered this idea. Will the NYSERDA program, if it becomes a NYSERDA program, be in competition with traditional ESCOs? How is this different from ESCOs? Will it focus on markets not addressed by ESCOs? I guess could one or more of you touch on let's differentiate this concept from ESCOs, which are energy service companies, and what they offer to the market.
Well, I'll just start us off. I mean, I think this is probably a long conversation in itself. I don't know that ESCOs are in this market. These are costly projects, and ESCOs tend to focus on measures with an extremely high and immediate return for that ESCO. An ESCO is a bundling of construction services with a financial product. So by definition, their hurdle rate, their rate of return is going to be very different than what would be, there wouldn't be a rate of return calculation from this model.
Yeah, I would add, or a little over my head, but my understanding of the basic financing with that's because they focus on the mush markets, right? Municipality, university, schools, and hospitals. They're not really in the private buildings for the most part, and I think this would unlock, an ability for multiple kinds of firms to offer these kinds of turnkey services, and that's where I think the competition aspect is good, because a lot of people have different theories on the case of what makes sense in buildings. Like, go out and test it, and let's see what works.
Susan?
Well, I think you both kind of covered it, but yeah, I mean, limitations to what kind of buildings would be eligible. Again, this is available to any and all buildings, with a possible caveat that James explained about buildings that might be in financial distress or with pre-existing conditions that may make a solution infeasible or unviable financially for the building. But that's a small number of exceptions. Basically, this is available to all buildings, and ESCOs don't operate that way. I mean, I think a basic fundamental point is that this is, again, conceived of as a public-private partnership. So the ESCOs will be put in competition with one another. There will be a lot of safeguards built in from the public sector perspective, as James has been explaining. In some sense, I feel that we are kind of taking some of the best concepts of how the ESCO turnkey project delivery and financing type product works for certain, generally speaking, high credit quality, larger facilities, and pulling from that model and putting it in a new configuration in the public-private partnership and making it more viable for a wide range of buildings, smaller buildings as well. And in fact, I think that's a very interesting thing about this overall concept. As I think about it, there's really no aspect of it that doesn't have some existing precedent, some existing successful precedent. But we're putting the pieces together in a different way, and we're ensuring that it's accessible to all buildings that are subject to Local Law 97 in the case of New York City.
That's great. Thanks, Susan. There are a couple questions about whether there are existing precedents, so helpful to hear that. We've got just a couple minutes left. There is a heavily upvoted question focused on costs of electrification. Joe, you touched on this a little bit, but in some cases, deeper energy retrofits and electrification can be difficult to pencil in terms of potential savings. And the question is, how will this program address this, or how will it help with the, I'm going to take it to mean both the potential high upfront costs and potential operating cost increases, which can happen in some cases when you're looking at deeper electrification?
I think with any electrification project, it's important to not look at it as a project that has to happen all at once, right? I think most people in these industries that are in this room know that you would want to do certain things before you electrify a building to ensure that, the energy is being used as efficiently as possible. And so I think, an electrification project is not just simply the electrification of heating equipment or a fossil fuel combustion-based equipment. I think it's a bigger process and it's a bigger project. And I would say that doesn't have to happen all at once, because when it does, that's when it doesn't pencil out. And so I think, Local Law 97 is a 25-year law of compliance over time, over different compliance periods where those emissions limits ratchet down every 5 years, more or less. And so I think in order for these projects to pencil out, we need to see them as 25-year projects almost. And I think in order to make them efficient, we also have to look at what cycles are occurring in these buildings. When is there a capital cycle? When is there a building or a piece of equipment that's reaching its end of useful life? When is the most opportune time to do this work? And I think we, in crafting a program, would be able to make certain decisions about how the program would work and say, maybe you would only be eligible to receive funding and contractor assistance to upgrade your boiler if it's at its end of useful life. But let's look at the rest of your building. Let's look at what other work needs to be done before that or could happen around that. Can there be a partial electrification of your domestic hot water system? Or, can we put in some sort of partial electrification that, partly heats or cools your building? And so I think there's a lot of different ways to look at this, but I will say one lesson that we have learned from this is when you try to do it all at once, it doesn't work.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. We're pretty much at time, so I want to say thank you to James for setting a stage for us. Thank you to all of our panelists for contributing your time and your expertise to a fascinating discussion. I'll also say that we at Urban Green are very excited about this concept and its potential to be part of the solution set that the Local Law 97 market has been asking for. We, in all our policy work, rely on many of you in the audience for your expertise, and we look forward to engaging with you in the months ahead on this idea. That's the end of session one, and I think we're taking a short break before we move on. Oh, no, sorry, not yet. Please stay in your seats.
Great. Let's give a big round of applause to our first panel.